Okay, so obviously there's been some interest in water in this conference, and I wanted to summarize some of the research that I've done with water and intent. And I guess since the pictures are nice and clear, you can see the picture on the left where the man's intent to, you can see, no, turn it off, right, don't turn it off. You can see that he's standing on a cover here, and his intent is obviously to get the water to go out and through the hole, whereas in this slide, the picture on the right, the intent of the water perhaps is more interesting than the intent of the man, who's like a small little guy over there. Anyway, so in this context, I wanted to just introduce the anomalous effect of electromagnetic fields on water, because there is a scientific rationale and basis for looking at the effects of intention and consciousness on water, if in fact we can make parallels between the energy of consciousness and the energy of an electromagnetic field. And it turns out that in as early as the 1960s, when Russian scientists started looking at the physical effects on the physical properties of water that were induced as a result of exposure to an electromagnetic field. What's particularly important here is that these physical effects are observed after you turn off the stimulus. So in fact, the water seems to remember the fact that it was exposed to an electromagnetic field. In my own research back into the 90s, which is an experiment I did with actually Bill Tiller, we looked at the difference between a magnetic field, the B component of a magnetic field and the magnetic vector potential, which for those physicists in the audience, it turns out that the A field is an important component for storing and structuring of water. But moving on, the list now is pretty long of the physical kinds of changes that can occur in water exposed to an electromagnetic field. And since we've been talking about oxygen content in the previous slide, that's, I think, of interest, that the oxygen content in the water can change. Now, in the Bioelectromagnetic Society, they've been studying the effects of electromagnetic fields on biological systems for many years. Again, it was the Russians who decided, well, maybe these effects are mediated by water, as Gary had alluded in his talk. And what they did was they exposed water to an electromagnetic field and then added the treated water to cells in culture. In this particular experiment, kidney cells, which were exposed to a magnetic field, a very high frequency magnetic field, 42 gigahertz. And then they were able to measure the change in the electrophysiological properties of these cells, in particular the opening and closing of the potassium channel, which you can see on the bottom is very much enhanced by the information stored in the water. You can see this effect as much as 20 minutes after the exposure. So this clearly is an anomaly in terms of any kind of physics to explain this phenomenon. Now, that's the background. Of course, here we're more interested in effects of intention on water. So we start with, can intention also change the physical properties of water? Douglas Dean first did these experiments back in 1983. Stephen Schwartz followed by similar kind of experiments using various forms of spectroscopy to measure the change in the water. I did some similar experiments in 1994 and published it in JSE, as it happens, my first introduction to the society. And I did some other experiments with Raman spectroscopies, unpublished. And of course, we all know Dr. Emoto's work changing the crystallization patterns of water exposed to intention. So I wanted to elaborate more on my experiments, because not only can you change the structural properties of water, but when you add this water to a biological system, you can influence the biological system just as has been done with an electromagnetic field. The first series of experiments that I did was when I was working at the Institute of Heart Math, and we were demonstrated that Water could change in fact, ultraviolet absorption spectroscopy was used, which actually measures the oxygen content of the water. And this was altered, and then when you added that treated water treated with the intention of the loving intention to just actually, it wasn't an intention to specifically affect the water, the intention was just to be in a loving state and direct that intention to the water. That water, when it was added to DNA, actually caused the DNA to wind. And those of you who were here last year heard the summary of my research on DNA as a target for direct healing intention. But in this particular case, it was mediated through water. Since Dean Rein is in this audience, I don't really want to elaborate on his experiments, but he repeated the Emoto experiments and was able to show that water treated with positive intentions were perceived differently. The aesthetic appeal was different when you looked at the images that were structured by the water. So this is the first series of background information that you can transfer the intention that is stored in water. In the present experiments that I want to talk about, we're going to use a different model system. In this case, it's the growth of tumor cells in vitro. In the abstract, I mentioned other experiments that I've done with lymphocyte proliferation, but in fact, I want to mention not those experiments, but more the ones with tumor cells. In this case, the water was treated, and then with that water, you make tissue culture medium, and you add that tissue culture medium to the cells and measure the growth of tumor cells. Just to be technical, here's the detailed explanation. The tumor cells were split into 12 Petri dishes. Half were treated and half were non-treated simultaneously in a second room with a non-healer who was mimicking the action of the healer, kind of doing this with their hands and trying to simulate what was going on. The treatment was a 15-minute treatment. The experiment was done blindly. The treated tissues were blindly labeled so that when I actually did the experiment, I didn't know which was which. Actually, there were two kinds of experiments done, either direct experiments where the healer treated the tumor cells directly or where they treated the water. The cells were harvested and DNA fraction was obtained, and then what you basically measure is the amount of radioactive thymidine incorporated into DNA compared to the total amount of protein, which is a measure of cell growth. And there are biochemists in this audience. One of the few audiences I talk to where there are biochemists. Great. So there's the protocol. The particular healer that I used was Leonard Lasko, who's written a book called Healing with Love. And he was actually able to, with the aid of meditation, obtain certain transpersonal states of consciousness where he could actually obtain different intentions. In this particular experiment, he used 3 different intentions. One was for the cells, now remember these are tumor cells, to return to the natural order and harmony of their normal non-tumorous state. Intention number 2 was unconditional love with no specific direction to the cells. And intention number 3 was the release of diseased energy into the void. If any healers in the audience, this would kind of make sense for us. Well, you know, we all understand unconditional love, but anyway, these are the kind of healing intentions that he used with his people who he healed. Okay, so the first results were obtained when I wanted to show you the difference between direct and indirect treatment, kind of the question that I had asked Gary. So when I say indirect, I mean the water was treated and then the water was given to the cells. And on the y-axis here, we have the % inhibition of growth. So the tumor cells slowed down their growth in all cases. The magnitude of the effect is actually quite similar, 25% versus 38%, direct versus indirect. Yes, direct is a little bit stronger, but quite similar. Okay, now here's an unusual, oh, I should go back. This particular intention was the return to the natural order. When you change the intention, you get a very different pattern. You see an effect when the water is treated, but you don't see an effect directly when this intention is directed toward the tumor cells. Now we can discuss this, and I'm not really sure. This is a real anomaly for me. This is not at all what I expected, so this can't be an experimenter effect. And this effect was seen with the loving intention, and it was seen with the dematerialization intention, but it was not obtained with the return to the natural order. So this phenomena is, at this point, completely unexplained. I really don't have an explanation other than to say that certain intentions resonate with water in a different way and can be stored in a different way, and therefore and can be read by the biological system in a different way. So this is, preliminary experiments, which is the whole purpose of being in this kind of society. This is unpublished data, but there clearly is an effect on the different intentions. So that is my conclusion, that the healing effects can be direct or they can be indirect, that water seems to mediate the effects. Water, in this case, is storing the information, and the treatment time is over 15 minutes, as I said, but the biological system is reading the information stored in the water over a 24-hour period, because the growth period was over a 24-hour period. It seems that some intentions are quite effective and some are not effective. There's a difference between direct and indirect. And it seems that there's a lot of unknown phenomena, anomalous phenomena occurring. Okay, since I do have a couple more minutes, I want to address the possible mechanisms how this phenomena could be occurring. Now, water memory is actually, it's controversial, but there is some scientific literature that water can remember heat exposure, that's thermal memory, and that's known that the vibration and rotation modes of the water molecules can store heat energy. Ultraviolet energy can be stored in electron transitions of the water molecule. There's even a phenomenon called hydration memory, which is in the scientific literature, published in peer-reviewed journals. In this case, it's been done with enzymes and particular chemicals that are added to the water that affects the enzymes. The resultant effect on the enzyme activity, it has more to do with the ability of the chemical to structure the water than it does with the chemical structure of the additive, which is an interesting phenomenon. So in addition to the traditional mechanisms, we have non-traditional mechanisms. And we've actually heard a little bit about the hydrogen bond this afternoon, which allows water to form clusters. And this is one possible mechanism, except for the fact that these clusters kind of appear and disappear and flicker on and off. So if the information was to be stored in the structure, as soon as the structure dissipates, you would think the information would just dissipate along with it. So I'm not sure that's the best of explanations. There are various other explanations. I think the most likely explanation is the one that was proposed by Del Giudice a couple of years ago, where he described quantum domains in water. So in addition to having these structural clusters of water, we have quantum domains, which are described in terms of quantum fields within the quantum domains and coherent oscillations between the coherent domains. So it seems to me that that's one likely possible explanation because of the quantum nature of consciousness. So I'm throwing that out as possible mechanisms. There are other mechanisms involved, these superconducting filaments and solitons, and for all the physicists in the audience, obviously there are a lot of theories out, but very little bit of correlation between the theory and the experimental data. Since I have 30 seconds left, I want to thank you for your time. That's it. Okay, so we really have 5 minutes.
Has anyone looked at investigated the other logical possibility that distant intentional effects on tumor growth could be in the negative direction to increase the tumor growth rate?
Yes, from other experiments that I've done with the same healer, where we were more focusing on direct experiments. These were not actually done at a distance. They were done in the lab, and the healer just laid his hands on the water. But depending on his intention, yes, he could inhibit the growth. If he visualized the endpoint was fewer cells in the Petri dish, the actual growth was, more, I'd say the opposite, more cells. He could actually stimulate the growth as well as inhibit the growth depending on the intention.
Glenn, two quick questions. Could you comment on the level of purity of the water, A, and B, the second question is, would hydration memory be most like a homeopathic dilution?
Well, the first question is easy. It was deionized water, standard laboratory water that we use to measure, to make tissue culture medium. Hydration memory and homeopathy. I have to think about that. Yeah, I hadn't actually thought about that, but that's a very feasible explanation, because it's the presence of a chemical which actually structures the water and then has a resultant effect. So yes, that's a very feasible mechanism for homeopathy.
Question. If I understand correctly, you've shown that intention affects the structure of water.
Right.
And you've also shown in other experiments that intention applied to water or to a subject affects healing. Or produces healing.
An effect on the biological system,
right.
Correct.
But so the question still remains, is it the structure in the water that produces the healing when that water is given to the what needs to be healed, or is it just a direct effect of that intention, and the water could have been applying the intention to that lamp instead, and it still would have healed that person? So it seems to me the way to really prove that it's the water structure that has done the healing and not just the intention directly would be to show, for example, that the degradation of the structure in the water correlates in time with the degradation of the healing power, or something like that. Has anything like that been done?
The we don't know how long it lasts in compared to the electromagnetic exposure, which we know lasts about 20 minutes to half an hour. Have I looked at that much? No, I do not know how long it lasts, and I have not made any such correlations. And nobody has done those kind of experiments, and the few scientists who do these kind of experiments usually are first looking at the phenomenological aspects of it. The phenomena is, that water seems to be able to carry the information of intent. And once you have that phenomena, then you can go into much more details. The first attempt at even looking at the mechanism is to say, is there a structural change in the water that correlates with the storage of the information? So that's the first attempt. And obviously there's a lot more experiments to do.
Glenn, would you share with us the difference between the sham healing of the water as well as the cells? I didn't see that clearly represented in your slides. Maybe I missed something.
Okay. The tumor cells were split into two batches of cells, 6 Petri dishes and 6 Petri dishes, and I had a second person independently bring the dishes to the healer in one room and the non-healer in another room. And then during the 15-minute period, the healer did his intention thing, and the non-healer, well, actually, I didn't mention that, but in some experiments, I actually had the non-healer read a book so that
but
they
what were the results of the sham healing? That was my question. I understood the method.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. The data was presented as the percent inhibition, and I see, relative to the control.
Yeah, I'm talking about the sham healer compared to the Leonard Laskow.
Right. The magnitude of the effect was taken into account, and I actually did the difference between the healing and the non-healing modes. I don't have the raw data, this is kind of what you're asking, on the magnitude of the effect. I have to remember what the raw data was. It was a nominal effect, and I subtracted that out from the data, so I showed you the effect that was due to the healer. But yes, I probably should have showed you the raw data. Okay, thank you very much.